What is happening to the future of men? Dr. Leonard Sax has been studying this for a long time. It started with a conversation he found himself having over and over again with concerned moms coming into his office with their boys and a note from the school saying, hey, would you consider some medication to get this kid in line? And Dr. Leonard Sax started realizing it wasn't the kids that were the problem. It was the authority over the kids and the school's failures to recognize the differences between boys and girls, their timetables and the like. That's what started the study. Where it ended up, though, is something I think every adult should be worried about. The future of men and what's going to be happening. Where are we going to be as a society if we don't do something about it? Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnet. Well, Dr. Leonard Sax, you probably won't remember the conversation that we had last fall because I know you do a million of them, but I remembered, and I remembered the book so much and went back and referenced it a couple of times after that. And I got to say, it's really staying with me, and I think your research is probably is probably maybe even seems a little muted when a couple of new stories that have come out since your book has get added into the mix. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure what you're referring to now.
Well, it just sort of seems like every survey says the same thing that your book was getting at, except it seems like the timetable may be moving up faster. More and more women are complaining about where are the real men. More and more parents are saying, how do I get my kid out of my basement? I mean, it seems like this story is really taking on legs. And you were one of the first to kind of raise the red flag about it.
Well, I don't know if I was among the first, but many authors have been talking for a number of years now about boys disengaging young men who are not motivated. I think what's unique about my book, Boys Adrift, is that I bring in research from a variety of different perspectives about what's happened over the last 20, 30 years. Very different factors that have come together in a sort of perfect storm to have the effect of disengaging boys from the real world.
Well, I will say my wife reads a lot of the women's magazines, and there's just been a lot of articles about this. And every time it comes up, we'll look at each other and go, Boys Adrift. It just sort of seems like you really hit it.
Yeah.
So let's define what we're talking about, though, for before we get into it. And I may, if it's all right with you, I kind of may rearrange your chapters a little bit because a couple of things that kind of struck me first to get to. But all right, so what are we talking about? We say the differences between, say, adolescents now and adolescents 30, 40 years ago.
Well, one simple way is just to look at a New York Times story, very thorough investigation by a team of reporters to the New York Times who looked around the United States and asked the question, who's graduating with honors? Who's doing well at American colleges and universities? And they found that today, when you look across the country, you find that about 4 out of 5 kids graduating with honors at a whole variety of different American colleges and universities are women. 4 out of 5 graduates with honors are women. Now, if you look 30 years ago, the majority of kids graduating with honors at colleges and universities were men. So what's happened? I mean, look, the fact that more women are going to college and doing well there is great. That's cause for celebration. That's not the problem. The problem is, the question is, why aren't their brothers keeping up with them?
Why can't it be 50-50?
Exactly. Why isn't it 50-50? Why is it overwhelmingly women who are excelling? And this is true not just at college, as the New York Times reporters point out. This doesn't begin at college. This begins in first grade. You go to elementary school in the United States, and who cares about doing well? Who cares about getting a good grade? Beginning in first grade, it's girls who are concerned about getting a good grade and working hard, and it's guys who are goofballs. Now, I know that you have some younger people listening to this program. By younger, I mean people under 30 years of age.
Yeah.
And when people under 30, when I do these presentations and such for an audience that includes young people under 30, they often say, what's new here? Hasn't that always been the case? Hasn't it always been the case that girls work hard and guys are goofballs? And you have to remind them, no, actually, it hasn't always been the case. In ancient times, before you were born, 40 years ago, there was a singer in this country, a black man, a vocalist named Sam Cooke, who had a #1 song where he said, I don't know much about history. He said, and I may not be an A student. He says, but I'm trying to be. He says, I'm trying to be an A student because maybe by being an A student, baby, I can win your love for me. He mentioned specifically French, geometry, and trigonometry as subjects. He's going to try and work harder and get a better grade because he thinks that by getting an A instead of a B, he will raise his status in the eyes of the pretty girl. I don't think you can imagine Akon or 50 Cent or Justin Timberlake saying, I'm going to work harder. I'm going to study harder for my trigonometry test.
Right. No, actually, I got to jump in and say, remember, it's 50 cents. If you want to be, it's fitty. Yeah. So here's my. I'll even take that in a news story this week that made me think of your book, and I was looking forward to having this conversation about it. My wife and I were talking about this, that the number of women who are in college, what's the percentages now for, not even for women who are overachieving in college, but what's the percentage of women in college?
Yeah, 58-42 nationwide.
Okay. And in certain majors, it's kind of a staggering like 70-30. I mean, in certain majors, it's overwhelming. Like pre-law and pre-med now are fairly dominated by women, aren't they?
Well, this is an interesting point because the United States medical schools make a real effort to maintain roughly 50-50 ratio in admissions. And the result is that they will admit boys who are less qualified in order to keep that 50-50 ratio. Now, Bill Bennett has a radio show, and he was interviewing the director of admissions at Princeton College, and she told him that if they had gender-blind admissions at Princeton, the college would be 70-30, 70% women.
Right.
Because she said the young men, they're decent, they've got good grades and good test scores. She said, but the young women are incredible. They not only have straight A's and top test scores, but they're going out and feeding the poor and housing the homeless and finding new vaccines and starting their own nonprofit organizations. The women are incredible. And she said, but we don't want to have a 70-30 ratio on the campus. So we basically practice affirmative action for guys.
Right. And the reason I bring that up, though, is that these were some fields that had been traditionally sort of male-dominated disciplines. You might have had a stronger turnout for women in, elementary education or in sociology or other things, but there are no fields left for guys where, if they're not getting this kind of bump, where they're going to be competitive. And I thought of that this week for the weirdest reason, and I'm probably totally wrong. So let me just say up front, I'm the dumbest guy I know, and I'm probably totally wrong on this. But I thought it was interesting that when they reported the death toll from the shooting at Northern Illinois University, it was four out of the 5 victims were women. And I looked at what the witnesses said, and that was he started firing at the first rows and worked his way up. And I thought that's fairly reminiscent to me of the college lecture classes that I would have attended, where the eager students tended to be more female, and they tended to sit right down in front. And us goof-off guys tended to be the ones that sat on the back or on the aisle seats, ready to duck out at a moment's notice. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I thought that might explain why there were more female victims than male. I mean, maybe he was aiming, but I heard that he wasn't particularly aiming at the women. But it just sort of seemed like, gosh darn it, that was a geology class, and there were more women victims in that room than there were male.
Well, certainly it's generally true that you find that the women sit toward the front and most of the men sit toward the back, although the geeky guys will tend to sit in the front rows too. Well,
that was just the pattern of his shooting, and I thought that was indicative of something. Anyway, yeah, I go to this because there's more to this, too. I mean, it's not just these kind of numbers. We have some statistics where it was the sperm count is down, isn't it? But testosterone levels and estrogen levels and the physiology of boys turning to men is different.
Well, that's a good point. And that, again, is one of the features that distinguishes my book from some of these other books about what's going on with boys and young men in the United States is that as a medical doctor, I draw on a lot of the medical research and the research specifically on what's happening with sperm counts, testosterone levels, et cetera, in the United States. And indeed, I consulted at length with a number of the researchers directly doing this work, such as Dr. Shanna Swan at the University of Rochester. She has led a number of studies looking at sperm counts using a variety of research sources and databases looking back over the past 50, 60 years. And it is very well established from her work and the work of others that the average sperm count of a young man in the United States today is less than half what his grandfather's was 50 years ago. The testosterone level of a man in the United States today is substantially lower than his father's was 20 years ago. You mentioned the Women's Magazine a moment ago, and I was looking at this month's issue of Cosmopolitan, actually, in part because it's relevant to the next book I'm working on now, which is about what's going on with young women. And the big article in this month's Cosmopolitan is about women who want it and their male partners don't. And,
right.
and the big picture is a very attractive woman in pantyhose and an unbuttoned blouse, and her boyfriend is uninterested. He's looking in the other direction.
Right.
And this is a growing phenomenon, and it's one that old people, that means people our age, your age, and my age, is really hard to imagine because when we were, in college, sex was a high priority, to be blunt. And you talk to college women today, and they will tell you about going to parties where the guys are much more interested in playing Halo than they are in talking to the women.
Right.
And I actually had a fascinating conversation with some men at Wabash College, which is an all-male college in Indiana. And they were saying how they've been so indoctrinated since they were young about these are 18 and 19-year-old boys I was talking with. They've been so indoctrinated about how it's wrong to harass women and wrong to admire women and wrong to go up to women and say anything that has a remotely sexual sense to it, that one of these men said to me, you know what, we've gotten the message all along that the right thing to do as a boy is not to interact with girls.
Right.
And so, fine, we say, we'll go and play our video games. And that really put it in a very blunt light, that one aspect of that, and it's only one part of why boys are, frankly, less interested in girls than they were 30 years ago. And by girls, I mean actual real-world girls. This is a key point because boys are very interested in pornography. That hasn't changed. In fact, that's also transformed. Boys today are much more vocal about pornography than boys were 30 years ago. Boys today are very willing to tell you what kind of pornography they like, what websites they subscribe to. Whenever I talk to a group of young men, I ask them, what porn sites do you guys look at? And, to me, it's kind of embarrassing even to ask that question because I'm an old guy. I'm 47. But these guys, these 17-year-olds, they love talking about it, and they debate it. It's very scholarly debate. They argue the merits of the various porn sites with great authority and lots of experience. It's the real-world girls that they find uninteresting, and they're very blunt about that. They'll say, girls here are fat, and they want you to do stuff. They're very blunt. They much prefer pornography. To me, this is baffling because in my era, 30 years ago, we might look at Playboy or Penthouse, but we were kind of ashamed of it because that was a substitute for the real thing.
Right.
It was unquestioned that the real thing, having sex with a real girl, was enormously better than just looking at pornography.
Well,
that's an assumption that young men today do not share. The notion that the real world trumps the virtual world is something that young men today just don't buy.
And when I was a teenager, and I think we're roughly the same age, To us, Playboy was kind of a shopping guide. It was sort of a catalog. We kind of get an idea. It was sort of like the Sears Christmas wish book or something.
Yeah, but it was no more a substitute for the real thing than looking at a menu would be a substitute for having a dinner.
We would never take the wish book over the actual toys.
Exactly.
We wanted to order by midnight tonight.
Exactly. And young men today have a different perspective, and there's a couple reasons for that. But I think the declining testosterone levels are part of it.
I think that's and I want to go back to that too, because you're talking about this research that is not just declining testosterone, but declining sperm counts. What can account for a 50% drop in sperm in essentially 2 generations?
Yeah, well, that's of course the focus of the chapter on endocrine disruptors, substances in our environment, substances that never existed on this planet until 30 years ago, like bisphenol A and polyethylene terephthalate, which are now ubiquitous. And I've got when I go to these talks, I typically wander up the aisles, kind of Oprah style, and I pick up a bottle of bottled water that someone has. I say, "May I borrow your water here?" And they look at me. They kind of think I'm strange, and I say, "Let me just borrow it for a moment." And I show it to the audience. I say, "This bottle of bottled water here, this clear plastic, this substance is called polyethylene terephthalate. Didn't exist 50 years ago, and now it's everywhere in North America." And you got a truck carrying a truckload of bottled water on a hot summer day. That truck is not air conditioned. We don't. It's not refrigerated. We don't ship bottled water in refrigerated trucks. And what we now understand is that that truck warms up inside only about 80, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and that water sits in that bottle. And that substance, polyethylene terephthalate, begins to leach into the water. And you consume 2 of those bottles, you have ingested the estrogen equivalent of a birth control pill. That is 1-ethinyl estradiol pill. You are emasculating the men, and this is not true just of bottled water, of course, but any soda that is shipped in a clear plastic bottle, which is the great majority of sodas. And this is true not only in humans, incidentally. We're seeing this in wildlife. The Florida panther is going extinct. Why is that? Well, it's not just a loss of habitat. When you examine the testicle and the sperm count, the Florida panther's testicles are all shriveled. Likewise, researchers looking at the fish in the Columbia River, when they look at the salmon, they found that the males are making eggs. And for those of your listeners who were a little weak on high school biology, the males are supposed to make sperm, the females make eggs. And this is not just true of the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest, but right here at home for me, which is the Potomac River. The Washington Post had a front page article about how fish in the Potomac River, the males now are making eggs rather than sperm, not just in the polluted part, but all the way up the tributaries into Maryland and Virginia.
Got to hang on to that, and we'll come right back there. That is just what I'm talking about. You're getting a better idea if you're listening to the work of Dr. Leonard Sax, not just a medical doctor, but also a clinical researcher. Dr. Leonard Sax coming up next on the future of men. His book is Boys Adrift, and if you think that's scary, you haven't heard anything yet. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnet. Well, maybe unlike the physiology of the reproductive organs of men, we're just getting warmed up on Coast to Coast AM, because it's not just the physical side of boys turning to young men, turning to adults in the next 30 years that we should be concerned about. It's also the psychology of it all. And the dice seems loaded against them. While at the same time, women decry, where are the real men? The fact is, the truth is that there's a lot of people out there who are putting pressures on boys to not become men. And they do it in ways that perhaps they don't even realize they're doing. We'll talk about that. It's amongst the research of the very fascinating book called Boys Adrift. Dr. Leonard Sax on the continued future of men next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet. Dr. Leonard Sax, both a medical doctor and a PhD, on his research about the future of men. And we were talking about the physiology of this. I don't want to give up on that conversation yet, too, because so sperm count is down to about half of what it was, and as testosterone is too. And that's a concern because I thought there was a connection between increased rates of depression and lowered testosterone.
Well, it's a little more complex than that. It's more to do with motivation. That is, a lower testosterone level doesn't necessarily make a man depressed, but it may make him less motivated. And I said a number of studies along these lines. But a man with a lower testosterone level need not be depressed. He can be perfectly happy. He just doesn't have the drive that we expect young men to have. And I've seen men like this in my own practice here in Maryland and around the United States and Canada. And the parents will say, mom will say to her son, she'll say, what is your problem? You sleep till noon. You spend most of your time playing video games. You're 28 years old. When are you going to get a life?
Right.
And the young man is like, what's the problem? I don't ask you for money. I work 12 hours a week at the Starbucks.
Right.
And,
12 hours a week.
So what is the problem?
Right.
He's not depressed. He's fine. It's his mom who's getting upset. And she's like, when are you going to get a life? You don't even have a girlfriend. And he says, well, I had a girlfriend, and she dumped me when she found out I only worked 12 hours a week at the coffee shop. And she's like, well, duh, what young woman wants to be with a guy who's just working 12 hours a week at the coffee shop? And he says, well, I like the online porn better.
Right.
Anyhow, he's not depressed. He's perfectly happy with his 55-inch flat screen that the parents have provided, and the online pornography and the video games, and he's happy. But he doesn't have any drive. He doesn't have any motivation, and he doesn't feel that he's missing out.
Well, these were all excellent points. I was really just thinking of specifically a friend of mine who was in his 30s and had these severe bouts of depression. He's a broadcaster and went to Baltimore. Actually, he had to fly to Baltimore, and he went into this testosterone treatment thing, and it brought him back in like 12 hours. I mean, ever since then he's been on these pills, and I know other people have done that. I'm only throwing that in there as kind of an aside because it just shows how complicated this can be. And when we see school shootings and office shootings and the rates of people who are on all these SSRIs and all this medication out there, I think these are some of the byproducts of the lower testosterone. But that neither here nor there is probably wrong. But when you look at the testosterone levels of, say, where our grandfathers were, did that have more to do, too, with manual labor, or did it have more to do with the types of work that people were doing? Or
no, almost certainly not. This is something Dr. Swan has looked at. You'll find that declining testosterone level as much in farmers working outdoors as you find in office workers. In fact, to some degree, the farmers have it worse because a lot of exposure to pesticides, a lot of these pesticides have a very emasculating effect as well. So it's not at all a question of occupation. It's a question of these substances, all these chemicals. You got to realize we are surrounded by chemicals. We are immersed in chemicals. We eat and drink chemicals, none of which existed 50 years ago. And in the book, I talk specifically about polyethylene terephthalate and bisphenol A and a few of the pesticides as well. None of these substances existed at all in human history. These are all substances that are less than 50 years old, some of them less than 30 years old. None of these have been studied, and we are consuming them in huge quantities. Hundreds of thousands of tons of these substances produced each year, and just about every American consuming them and exposed to them in large quantities, with very little understanding of you got to understand the hormonal balance. Hormones are substances that have an effect on our physiology and our psychology in very tiny quantities. You're talking about thousandths of a gram or 10,000th of a gram or 100,000th of a gram being able to profoundly influence your physiology. And these substances turn out to mimic the action of these hormones, and we're consuming them in large amounts. And the result is disadvantageous to both girls and boys, but the effects are very different. The effects on girls are to accelerate the onset of puberty. So you find girls going through puberty earlier than they did 30, 40, 50 years ago,
right,
by several years. And in boys, it disrupts or delays the onset of puberty. In girls, these substances substantially increase the risk of breast cancer. In boys, they mess up the whole penis, prostate, testicle thing. Prostate cancer enormously on the rise in the last 30 years. Genital malformations. Dr. Swan, once again, mentioning Dr. Shanna Swan, found that she could measure the urine of pregnant women and measure how much of the metabolites of these various plastic substances are in the urine, how much of is this woman exposed, and comparing the women who are most exposed to plastic, the women who are least exposed to plastic. The woman who's most exposed to plastic has a risk of having a baby boy, bearing a boy with genital abnormalities about 10 times higher than the woman who is least exposed.
And so we're talking about hermaphroditism of some sort?
Well, no. That's an extreme case. A true intersex child who's both male and female, that's quite another category altogether. We're talking about relatively minor genital abnormalities.
Well, you scared me with all that talk.
Undescended testicle.
Okay.
So undescended testicle actually used to be quite rare in the United States. It's very common now. And likewise hypospadias, which means that the opening at the end of the penis, is supposed to be at the tip of the penis. Hypospadias means it's not at the tip, it's on the underside of the penis. And that used to be, again, a rare anomaly, and it is now very common in the United States.
Well, you scared me with all that talk about fish producing eggs. So that's what got me thinking about the connection, the intersex connection between that. Now, what about you mentioned about women and, urinating and stuff. What about the amount of female hormones that are in the drinking water from all of the birth control pills?
Well, a number of people have made this point that ethinyl estradiol, the primary estrogen that is used in birth control pills, is quite robust and doesn't break down very easily. And so it passes right through that woman. She passes it into the urine. It goes down into the sewer system. It's not going to be filtered out by the wastewater treatment, and eventually you're going to end up drinking it. That's a true observation, but it probably is less relevant than the whole bottled water issue, because it is when you actually sit down and look at what people are measuring in the water, it seems that the birth control pills per se are probably contributing a small amount of these endocrine disruptors. Certainly the fish in the Potomac River that the Washington Post reported on, that are male fish bearing eggs rather than sperm, as males are supposed to do, they look carefully in the water in the Potomac. They don't find any ethinyl estradiol or other female hormones there. It's instead these other chemicals, these synthetic chemicals that appear to be having this effect. And you mentioned intersex. The curious effect of all these chemicals is to blur the sex differences. And this is true not only in our species, but in every species that's been looked at. So what is traditionally masculine and what is traditionally feminine is lost. And the boys start acting more like girls, and the girls start acting more like boys, which, to the mind of some people who are still living in the 1970s, they might regard as a good thing. Because back in the 1970s, the conventional wisdom was that masculinity and femininity are both limiting, and that the truly liberated human is kind of a unisex, androgynous, male-female hybrid. But that turns out to be empirically not correct. And I present some of that work in my first book, Why Gender Matters, and more of it in my second book, Boys Adrift. It turns out that boys who are not masculine are more likely to be depressed and less likely to be productive than boys who are masculine. So feminizing boys doesn't make them better or happier or more productive. It actually greatly increases the risk that that boy will be depressed, unproductive, and not fulfill his potential.
No, so the depression here is not necessarily with a lower testosterone, but because just the social factors of feeling like their life isn't fulfilling?
Well, why is it the case that that feminine boys are more likely to be depressed than masculine boys? I think you and I could conjecture. That finding actually is pretty new. Until recently, it didn't occur to anyone to ask the question whether feminine boys are more likely to be depressed. That's a fairly recent study, but we actually have several studies now showing quite clearly that you look at teenage boys who are less masculine are more likely to be depressed and suicidal compared with boys who are more masculine. Incidentally, boys who are less masculine are also more likely to inflict lethal violence. And this is another thing that's counterintuitive. When you actually look at who these school shooters are, who are these boys who bring guns to colleges and high schools and kill their classmates, they are not the most masculine boys. They are not the jocks. They are the least masculine boys. They are more likely to be effeminate. They may have been teased or bullied. And these are the boys who get their father's rifle or go out and buy a shotgun because they want to show everybody what a tough guy they are, and this is the only way they know to do it.
Yeah, and there's another part to that, actually, and I'd love a conversation about that in a second. I'll get back to that. But I'm going to go back to the idea of effeminate boys. Some of that couldn't that just be because some of those boys that are the less overtly masculine are actually struggling with a sexual identity issue and feeling disenfranchised from society. They don't want to come out. They're afraid of what happened. They've seen what happens when they're the ones doing the cheers instead of playing football.
That's clearly, I'm going to interrupt you right there. I see where you're going. And it turns out just not to be the case.
Okay, all right.
A couple things. You're hinting that homosexual men and boys are less masculine.
No. I'm not honestly, because I know lots of guys who are gay who are the starting quarterbacks of their football team.
Exactly.
I'm not saying that.
That's empirically what you find out to be the case. But
I'm not saying that.
In the culture, people often confuse effeminacy with homosexuality.
I realize
in fact, teenage boys themselves, if you find a boy who doesn't like to play football and would rather do ballet, it's very likely that his friends are going to tease him and say, you're a fag, you're gay. But empirically, when you look at the research, that's just not the case. Gay men are just as likely to be football players and ice hockey players as straight men are, and effeminate interests like preferring sewing and macrame over football is not a marker for homosexuality.
Oh no, I get that. Let me be clear then, just so I don't run into any issues on this. Part of what I've known to be true, and this comes because my brother is gay, and I've sort of been around this my whole life, is that there are certain gay guys in high school who totally fit in with the mainstream of the school. Nobody knows they're gay. It's not their sexuality is an issue. They may already be taking girls to the prom. It doesn't come out until sometime after high school or college. And yet there were other kids, there's that subset of group of kids who may also be effeminate, and they may also be questioning their sexuality. That was the only reason I was throwing that in there. There is that other group out there where they don't have something that covers for their way that they're questioning themselves or other people are questioning them. Fair enough?
That's fair enough, but it's not the phenomenon we're talking about.
Great.
Remember, best estimates are something like 3% of the population is gay. We're talking about something that affects much, much more of the population.
Well, that's interesting. What percentages are we talking about then?
Well, this is something I go into in the book Boys Adrift, because people will say, look, there's always been lazy boys. The notion of a lazy boy is not a new idea. You can go back 100 years and find people talking about lazy boys. So it's important to think about the numbers. And this is an issue I address in the book. And again, it's hard to compare across different time spans, but taking those factors into consideration. You look 50 years ago, for example, I cite the work of demographers in New York who've looked at this issue nationwide. They ask, for example, the question, men who are able-bodied, not disabled, not on sick leave or disability or anything like that, men who are not looking for work and not disabled. How many such men are there? Well, you go back 50 years. This is Andrew Beveridge and his colleagues in New York have looked around the United States at this question. 50 years ago, what was the likelihood of finding a guy in his 20s or 30s who perfectly healthy, who is not working and not looking for work? It was about 1 in 20 men, about 5% of men. You now find in the United States that it is about 1 in 5 and rising rapidly.
Get out.
1 in
Get
5.
out.
So we've gone from 5% of men to 20% of men not working and not looking for work. They will not show up in the Labor Department statistics because they're not part of the workforce.
Right.
They're not looking for a job. Now, some of these men are living in their parents' home. They're 30 years old, but they're living in their parents' home. Some of them are living off their wife. Their wife is working, and they are not. Those marriages, however, don't have a good prognosis because very few of these men are actually Mr. Dad. I'll find a few of them, and I've corresponded with a few of them. I had a small handful here in my own town here in Montgomery County, Maryland. But the great majority of these men who are married are not vacuuming under the sofa and changing the diapers. They are parasites, to be blunt. And then marriage is not going to last because that woman's coming home and she's still vacuuming under the sofa and changing the diapers, and her husband is watching TV, and she's going to, as one woman said to me, she said, I already had 2 babies at home. I didn't need a third,
right,
referring to her husband.
Right.
And what's really remarkable at the work of Andrew Beveridge and other sociologists looking at this is there's no taper in this trend line. I reproduced one of the graphs that he supplied. Just look at a map of the United States, and a white state means that there's a very low number of men who are not working and not looking for work. And then as the proportion rises, it gets darker. And then we got it from 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2004. And you see the whole country getting darker, darker, and darker, right, as a rising proportion of men are not working and not looking for work. This is a new phenomenon. It was rare 50 years ago. It is becoming common.
All right, coming up in the hour ahead then, I want to get to 2 topics. I'm just going to put them on the table for you, Dr. Sax. One is the phenomenon from the 70s. You referenced it earlier, but it was still prominent. I still run into it occasionally with my own boys, is looking at boys as defective girls, boys that need to be fixed. And then I just, because I so much enjoy your work on this, I want to talk about what's wrong with junior colleges. What's wrong with trade schools? We'll get to that coming up next hour. Then we'll get to your phones, too. The future of men. It's the scariest topic we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnet. Tonight's guest is Dr. Leonard Sax, and as both a medical doctor and as a clinical researcher, he's a doctor, and his work is so interesting because it goes both ways. And here, working in the front lines of these medical decisions that are being made, but then also researching on the other side of it. And what does it all mean? We're talking about the book Boys Adrift and the Future of Men. And I think a very relevant question I'd love to run past Dr. Sax before we get into about how boys have been framed as defective girls for too long. And it has to do with the shooting earlier this week, too, at the Northern Illinois University campus. I'd love to get his feedback on an idea next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet. Dr. Leonard Sax, it's a little off the topic, but I'd love to get your feedback on something that you mentioned last hour, talking about the shooter at Northern Illinois University. And we don't know a lot about this guy's life. We know that He was on some sort of SSRI, it would seem, and he just came off of his meds cold turkey. That was the report. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. So none of this could turn out to be true. But there's a certain psychology to news coverage. And I don't know if you know this, but news stations, local and or national, won't cover suicides. It's been a long-standing broadcast policy, same thing true with radio as well as television, to not go live, to not bring attention to somebody jumping off a bridge. It may be a huge topic. It may be a huge actual event that's going on. Somebody's going to jump off a bridge onto a freeway or something, but they won't cover it because by covering it, the journalistic belief has always been you would encourage other people to do it. They would see it. They would say, I want to go out that way, too. I'm going on TV. Everybody's going to know what a lousy life I had or how my boss did me wrong or whatever. And I think – I was just curious how you felt about this, but I think that's where we need to go back to that for these school shootings and office shootings, that they are really just elaborate suicides, whether they're suicides by their own gun or attempt to do suicide by cop. That's what this is all about. It's attracting people to their pain in their last minute, and that means having to take a lot of people with them. That's how they're going to do it. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think that's a good point, but it kind of ties into one of the main points that I'm trying to make in my second book, Boys Adrift, which is we've had a good 20 years in this country now of preaching zero tolerance, of discouraging boys from writing violent stories. In most school districts in the United States, boys are prohibited from bringing toy guns to school. In the book, I talk about a second-grade boy who was suspended because he brought a little toy plastic gun from his G.I. Joe that was like the size of his pinky. They actually had to tape it to the report to keep it from just vanishing altogether. We got this zero-tolerance policy where anything that looks like a gun is absolutely prohibited, in the belief that such policies diminish school violence. Well, that's a belief that we know to be false. It is absolutely not the case. Prohibiting boys from carrying toy guns does not decrease school violence. One could make an argument, it's not an argument I make in the book, but one could make an argument that it has the reverse effect of what it is intended to have, that far from diminishing school violence, one can make an argument that it promotes school violence. And how so? Well, for example, snowballs. 30 years ago, it was you could throw a snowball on school grounds and not be suspended from school.
Oh, yeah. I know this firsthand from my own kids. I know exactly what you're talking about.
In the United States, and I know you have some listeners in Canada, I was just in Ontario. I spoke at a variety of schools, at public and private schools, at 4 different venues around Ontario, and I'll be back next week, actually, at Niagara and Jordan Station in southeastern Ontario. In every public school district that I've spoken at throughout Canada and the various provinces, it is prohibited. Now, for example, in Ontario, York Region District School Board, I was looking at their policy, and I'm quoting this, I believe, verbatim. What it says is, snow shall remain on the ground. The throwing or kicking of snow is strictly prohibited. Consequences for violating this policy include suspension, and every student is to be advised of this fact. Now, what's accomplished by prohibiting the throwing of snowballs? Does it, in fact, stop boys from throwing snowballs? Of course it does, and the only thing it accomplishes is to decrease slightly the liability of the school. And that's why those policies are about, because everyone's afraid of getting sued. It wasn't developed with the intention of saying anything about boys, but the unintended consequence of policies that prohibit the throwing of snowballs, that prohibit carrying toy guns or toy hockey sticks to school, is to say to boys, don't throw your snowballs here. Go and do your boy stuff somewhere else. We don't want boys at this school to be boys. We prefer, why can't you just be more like Emily? Look at Emily. She's sitting still and being quiet, and she's writing about her feelings. Why can't you be more like that? What's wrong with you boys? And the message the boys get is that schools don't want boys to be boys. Schools want boys to be girls. There's something wrong with them. And so why is it the case that so many boys today, regard academic achievement as unmasculine? One reason is because the schools now send that message that schools are not places for boys. And the snowball policy is just one very small piece of that, but it is a piece of
Sure, and it's not even just throwing of a snowball. It's even the making of a snowball. It is forming snow into a ball is enough to get you already in trouble.
Yeah.
I think how fundamental somehow is it to us as humans, but even to some primal part of ourselves to form stuff. You get mud, you get stuff. You're always making stuff. I mean, you're just it's a great way for guys to work stuff out, even if they're not throwing it. And that brings us back to kind of the diminishing role of recess anyway, or physical activity, which is a great way for boys to burn it off.
Well, and also what is allowed at recess. So, for example, dodgeball is now, again, prohibited throughout public schools throughout the United States. You're not allowed to throw a ball at another student, and if you do, you get in trouble. Again, what does this accomplish? Well, the motivation, of course, it decreases schools' liability, but what it accomplishes is, again, it's sending this message to boys that, boy stuff, like running around and throwing things at people, is now prohibited. Why can't, as I said a moment ago, why can't you just be like Emily and sit still and talk about your feelings? Now, that's a good thing to do. So a lot of things that have happened on school campuses over the last 30 years have had the unintended consequence of giving boys the notion that school is for girls. School today is very different from what it was 40 years ago. And, of course, that's just one piece of it. And another part that I go into at pretty substantial length in the book is the way that school itself has changed and the acceleration of the early elementary curriculum. Imagine going into an American or Canadian school 40 years ago, elementary school, and just watch what's happening in kindergarten. 40 years ago, you would have seen kids doing a bunch of things in kindergarten. You would have seen them singing, dancing, playing, finger painting, playing duck, duck, goose, maybe going on a field trip to splash in a pond, chase after a tadpole. Today, you go to the same school 40 years later. What do you see in kindergarten? You see kids mostly sitting still, trying to learn to read and write. In other words, kindergarten looks an awful lot like first grade. Kindergarten curriculum has become the first grade curriculum of 30 years ago, but that acceleration of the early elementary curriculum took place without any awareness of the fact that the trajectories of brain development in girls and boys are profoundly different. And we can say this with certainty because nobody knew that until 7 years ago. This is new research for the National Institutes of Health and Harvard Medical School and a variety of other sources that I cite in the book, showing that in the language areas of the brain in particular, the brain of a 5-year-old boy looks pretty much like the brain of a 3.5-year-old girl. Asking 5-year-olds to sit still and be quiet and listen and write down the letters of the alphabet is not developmentally appropriate for many boys. And they're fidgeting and they're looking out the window, and I've got this parade of boys coming into my office with mom or dad, usually mom, carrying a piece of paper from the school saying, Justin or Damon or Carlos won't sit still, and would you please evaluate? Maybe he needs to be on Ritalin or Adderall or Concerta. And what I found in many cases is that these boys, the problem is not with the boy. The problem is with the school. The school is asking 5-year-old boys to do things that are not developmentally appropriate for 5-year-old boys to do. And the solution for many schools is to put the boys on medications. And the medications work. That's what's scary. You put that boy on Ritalin or Adderall, and he will sit still, and he will be quiet, and everyone's happy. The problem, though, is that these medications damage an area of the brain, appear to damage an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Now, what's the nucleus accumbens? It's not part of the cerebral cortex. It's way down at the base of the brain. It plays no role in cognition, in calculating or thinking. So if you damage the nucleus accumbens, you get a boy who looks fine and who feels fine and who can calculate fine and who can read and write fine. The nucleus accumbens is responsible for translating motivation into action. So that boy who took Ritalin or Adderall or Concerta for years becomes a lazy boy. He looks fine, he feels fine, he can calculate fine, there's nothing wrong with his computational abilities, but his motivation is unplugged. And
I've lived this a little bit in that we had a second grade teacher for one of our boys who had a list going on the blackboard of the kids that were in trouble. And every day it was a list of boys' names because the criteria she applied for what was trouble was along that line. And then at the same time, there was a lot of video watching going on, a lot of very passive media absorption. And there wasn't the kind of stimulus where the kids, took a plastic hammer and pounded on a piece of plastic and did that for 10 or 15 minutes and felt much better afterward and were then able to better learn. There wasn't any of that. There was this emphasis on, better take a pill. And then everything starts coming out like Pink Floyd's The Wall after a while, right?
Exactly.
So then what is the ramifications then for that kid, say, now not at 9, but at 29? And does that ever wear off? And what are we looking at for a whole, and again, I come back to so often my wife and I are reading something, we go back to Boys Adrift, we look at something in the paper, and there's this whole thing about the highest percentages ever in society of kids who are on SSRIs or being treated for ADD or ADHD. And it's turning into this almost like half. I mean, it's like this enormous percentage of the population. What is that going to mean 20 years from now?
Well, it's pretty scary. And David Gilmour, a professor of comparative anthropology.
And also the lead singer of Pink Floyd, to make the point.
Really?
It's a weird coincidence.
Whom I consulted. He spent his life, the Professor Gilmour I'm talking about at State University of New York, Stony Brook, as a comparative anthropologist, looking at different cultures, different times, different places. And his professional analysis, looking at American culture, is that this culture will not endure because we have boys and girls now who are on completely different life scripts. The girls are focused and motivated and concerned about getting a good job and getting ahead, and a growing proportion of boys are not at all on the same page. They don't value what the girls value. They do not value marriage and children. Young men today are likely to regard marriage and children as a burden to be avoided, whereas 30 or 40 years ago, a young man would very likely regard marriage and children as a destiny to be fulfilled. Not anymore. And so when you talk to Professor Gilmour and you say, well, what's the United States going to look like in 50 years or 100 years? He says, in 50 years, you come to the United States, you turn on the evening television, you will not find someone speaking in English giving the news from a secular perspective. He said you will find that's gone. The mainstream American culture that we know, which is English-speaking and secular, will be gone. The two cultures that will replace it, he says, are Spanish-speaking Roman Catholic culture and a fundamentalist evangelical Christian culture. Now, some of my best friends are evangelical Christians, and I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying this is Professor Gilmour's assessment, because those cultures, evangelical Christian culture and Spanish-speaking Roman Catholic culture, those are cultures that value marriage and children. Those are cultures that will survive. Cultures that value marriage and children, where young men and young women want to get married and have kids. Those cultures reproduce themselves. They will endure. But the mainstream American English-speaking culture we have today does not value marriage and children. It denigrates marriage and children. And there's so many illustrations of this, and I give a few of these in the chapter in the book, Boys Adrift, a chapter called The Revenge of the Forsaken Gods. And I love that title.
I do too. That's
one of my patients. So, for example, last year, what were the two biggest stories in the celebrity news? It was Brad and Angelina and their babies, and Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes and their baby. Very little mention made of the fact, and in most cases no mention made of the fact, that Brad and Angelina are not married, and Tom and Katie had their baby before they were married. Marriage has become irrelevant, a nuisance, an afterthought. It is completely secondary. And the fastest growing demographic, this is an important point I make in the book, fastest growing demographic in the United States is not young people living together without benefit of marriage. There's been a drastic decline in the marriage rate in the United States. And 10 years ago, the notion was that, young people are living together, they're not getting married, that's all. Not true. Not the case. Not so. What is happening? The fastest growing demographic in the United States and Canada are young adults never married living alone. that's the fastest growing demographic, because these, for example, the last study I included in the book before it went to press, study of college and university women and men around the United States. They asked all the men and the women, they said, do you plan on ever getting married? 2/3 of the men said, yeah, probably get married someday. Yeah, sure, definitely, why not? More than half of the women said, no, I am pretty sure I never want to get married. One of the women said, why would I want to marry one of these losers? That's really new. There has been no society that we know of in the history of the human race where more than half the women said, I don't want to get married. That's really, really new. And this, again, manifests this growing the irony is that ignoring gender differences for the last 20 years has not produced this unisex, androgynous, male-female hybrid. On the contrary, it's exaggerated gender differences in a very unhealthy way. So we now have more and more guys whose idea of a good time is staying at home playing their video games, and more girls who say, why would I want to be with one of these losers? Just hang out with my friends, all of whom are female.
Right.
Ignoring the gender differences has had the result of girls and boys going off in totally different trajectories in a way that Professor Gilmore thinks is going to lead pretty much to the extinction of the civilization that we know, which is mainstream secular English-speaking. And, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe this civilization doesn't deserve to survive, and the civilization that he believes will replace it on this continent, which will be a hybrid, he thinks, of Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics and evangelical Christians, maybe deserves it. Maybe this continent belongs to them.
Well, I want to explore that a little bit further, because I think there's some interesting stuff in there, and I'd like to hear more about some of the other groups that are traditionally thought of as being players in our society. For example, where is the Jewish community in that, or where's the growing presence of Islam in that too? But then I actually just want to run this by you. As I'm hearing the research of Dr. Leonard Sax. The book is Boys Adrift. We'll get more on this coming up in just a minute. I was watching one of these shows, these Bridezilla shows, where they have these. It's on Wii or it's on Lifetime or something. I guess that makes it sound like I'm lack testosterone right there. But anyway, so I'm watching one of these shows, and it was fascinating for me to see the woman in this Bridezilla show that's all about how these brides are out of control and whatever. And they're ape. I mean, they're completely obnoxious. They're bossing everybody around. They're yelling, screaming. And there's a guy sitting right next to her that is just holding her purse the whole time. And
that gets back to a point that you and I mentioned in the previous hour, which is that the effect of these environmental endocrine disruptors is that the women become more masculine and the men become less masculine.
Oh, they were like drunk club fighters. I mean, they didn't get the bouquet they wanted from the florist, and they were going to take somebody down for it. Meanwhile, the guy was parking the car and saying, "Oh, dear. Oh, now don't go off again like that, dear." And I thought, what's happened? What's happened?
Yeah, it makes for television comedy, but the problem is it doesn't make for a stable marriage.
And a stable country, for that matter. We'll come right back. We got to come back. We got to the break, and we'll get Dr. Leonard Sax next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet. So we're talking about men and the future of men and where it is all going. Some of it is a reflection that must be, I think, particularly worrisome to some parents who are probably hearing the show, who are thinking, oh, my God, that's exactly what my kid's doing. I didn't know. What can I do? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. Is there anything we can do to reverse this trend? Is there anything that we can do when it comes to the physiology of how men have been affected by the female growth hormones, the hormones in the water, the hormones that are coming off of the plastic bottles that guys are drinking from after sports, whatever? Is there anything we can do to try and bring this around? What can be done to get a kid out of the basement and, growing into full manhood instead of this sort of man-child business we've been talking about? Plus, I love Dr. Sax on what's wrong with a trade school. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnet. So, Dr. Leonard Sax, interested in all of these topics. Let's say I'm a 50-year-old woman and I've got a 29-year-old man-child living in my basement. What can I do?
You got a problem. The focus of the book is on parents of boys who are younger.
Right.
So, for example, the research in the National Institutes of Health found that what's an adult? An adult woman is a woman aged 22 or older. An adult man is a man aged 30 or over. By the age of 30, that brain is pretty much formed. And the most discouraging email I get is from parents who say, my son is 31 years old and he's not working, not looking for work, and perfectly content. What am I supposed to do? Look, I'm not an advice guru. I'm simply a medical doctor sharing what has worked in my practice and what the scholarly research has demonstrated. And I'm only going to share things that I know to be effective. I'm not going to conjecture or speculate or guess.
Right.
I have nothing to offer that parent. There is no intervention that's reliably effective for a boy who's over 30 years old. But now if that boy's 9 or 15 or 23, then I think there's a lot of things we can do.
Wow. So there's no like hormone injections or anything they could take that might break the cycle of this?
Well, now that's an interesting question. And I said that when I'm talking to a parent, I will not conjecture or hypothesize, but I'm talking to you, so we can conjecture and hypothesize.
Okay, good.
Yes, it's entirely possible that giving hormone shots to some of these young men who have clinically low testosterone levels and are unmotivated might be helpful. But no one's tried this in a scholarly way. That is, no one has said, let's take some of these men who are in their late 20s, early 30s, unmotivated, not looking for work. Let's try giving them deletestrol, which is a very safe form of testosterone. Let's give them an injection every 2 weeks and see if it helps. It might help, but that's conjecture. That's a hypothesis. That hasn't been tested. It hasn't been proven.
And then as far as, but younger kids, there is a way, this is up to a certain point, this gets set in stone. But until that point, yeah, maybe there's things you can do if your kid, to reverse this and get sperm count up and get testosterone up and...
Well, it starts, or at least the simplest intervention for many parents, is to look at the school.
Okay.
So if you've got a 9-year-old or a 14-year-old who says, school's a stupid waste of time, what do I care? And I hear this from so many parents, and it's particularly striking if they have a son and a daughter. A parent, tells me, my daughter Melissa is really focused. She's concerned about getting good grades, and she does get good grades. And my son Justin, he's just as bright as Melissa, but he just doesn't seem to care what kind of grades he said. And Mom says, I said to him last night, I said, are you ready for your Spanish exam? You got your Spanish exam, and you're playing your video game. I don't think you should be studying for your Spanish exam. And he says, no, video game's more important. Well, Mom doesn't understand that. The video game's just a game. The Spanish final is important. It's going to affect your grade. Might affect what kind of college you can get into. Doesn't that count for more? He says, no. He says, I know I can get to the Kilimanjaro round in Halo.
Right.
Getting to the Kilimanjaro round in Halo, you got to kill 12 aliens in 30 seconds. And if you do that, the computer says, Kilimanjaro, and you get to the Kilimanjaro round, and it will save that automatically, and you can bring the other guys over tomorrow, and you can replay that, and they will be so impressed because it's very difficult to do because the aliens are shooting at you, and it's not at all easy to get to the Kilimanjaro. You get to the Kilimanjaro round in Halo, you will enormously raise your status in the eyes of the other guys. If you get an A instead of a C on your Spanish final, you probably don't even want the other kids to know that because getting a good grade will not raise your status in the eyes of the other guys. So for the boy, it's very obvious. The video game is more important than studying for the Spanish final. The virtual world's more important than the real world. But for Mom, it's like, it's a real generational disconnect here. She doesn't understand the allure of the video games.
Well, I think that brings us to this other question, which is that maybe, to a certain degree, with a certain percentage of boys, the idea of a 4-year collegiate education really isn't that important anyway. And that maybe that's part of the problem here, that maybe there is a disconnect in some households where they're channeling all of the boys' energy into becoming an accountant when he would make a great auto mechanic that also was a Halo champion on the
death of the trades, which is a big focus of the book. What about plumbing? What about auto mechanic? What about carpentry? In preparing the book, I interviewed Miles Gladstone, who's Director of Human Relations for Miller & Long, which is our country's, America's largest contractor. When there's a big NFL stadium build, you can bet Miller & Long will be pouring the concrete for that stadium. They do a lot of huge jobs around the United States. And when I spoke to him, he just returned from El Salvador. And I said, what were you doing in El Salvador? Because they don't do any business in El Salvador. They don't build anything in El Salvador. All their business is in North America. And he explained to me that about 3/4 of their workforce comes from El Salvador. And I said, well, why can't you don't you recruit here? Why can't you get young men in this country to do this? He said, well, we try, but they don't want to. You can make $80,000, $100,000 a year. He said, people don't understand what we do, concrete contractors. They think, it's just like building sandcastles on the beach. They don't understand. This is high-tech stuff. We're uploading the architect's plans into the computer on this heavy equipment, and we're using computer-assisted design, computer-assisted manufacturing. We're using laser-guided levels. This is very high-tech stuff. You got to go through a very intensive program with us, but if you put in the hours and you do the work, you can be earning $80,000 to $100,000 a year operating this machinery for us. And it doesn't. We tell this to the high school boys here in Washington D.C. They don't want. It doesn't interest them. It doesn't motivate them. They don't care about the money. They'd rather just play their video games. They get guys into the system from the United States, and they don't stick with it. I tell another story. A neighbor of mine who's a plumber was trying to recruit young men and women for that matter, but the women didn't want to sign up to be apprentice plumbers. And he was saying, look, if you learn this trade, if you learn how to be a plumber, you are set for life. No clerk in Bangalore, no labor force in China is going to be able to fix a clogged toilet in Frederick County, Maryland. They're always going to need to call a local plumber to do that. You do this job, you do good work, and you're an honest workman, you can earn $80,000, $100,000 a year, no problem. And you don't need a college degree. You don't need anything beyond your training here with us. What we're going to do with you over the next couple of years here. That's all you need. By the time you graduate high school, you will be ready to go. And the Frederick County School District said, all right, you can get 50 students to sign up, we'll let you do it. They couldn't find 50 in the entire county. There's 20,000 students. They couldn't find 50 kids who wanted to learn plumbing. They got 20, and the school said, all right, county said, you can go ahead and do it. At the end of the first semester, they were down to 4. The kids had all dropped out. The young men had all dropped out. Women didn't sign up, and the men dropped out. They didn't care. They weren't motivated. In the United States today, it's easy to find. You live in a big city anywhere in this country. It's easy to find a good doctor or a good lawyer. Try to find a good plumber or a good carpenter who's under 40 years of age and born in this country. You can't do it. You can find a carpenter or plumber over 40. You can find a carpenter or plumber who's born in some other country, Mexico, El Salvador, etc., and came here. But young men in this country do not want that kind of work. Why? Well, you've made a couple good points. One is that we've had this weird notion in this country over the last 30 years that it's some kind of failure to go into the trades, that every student is supposed to go to college, and if you don't go to college, you're defective. Now, this is a very weird notion that came out of nowhere. It's one of the changes in American education I talk about over the last 40 years, had the unintended consequence of disengaging boys. That boy who might have been a master carpenter or master plumber is now sitting at home playing video games. He doesn't want to go to college and write essays about how he would feel if he was stranded on an island. It doesn't interest him. He'd like to work with his hands, but that work has been degraded, and he doesn't even know it. One of our good friends is a mechanic. And he can't find young men who want to tinker under the hood of a car today. He says the guys who want to tinker under the hood of a car, they're getting old. They're all our age. They're in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Teenage boys don't want to tinker. Very few. You'll find a few, but
sure.
But it's much less common today. 30 years ago in this country, you find a group of men tinkering under the hood of a car, trying to improve its performance. You would have found a diverse group with teenage boys working with young men, working with middle-aged men. Today, the teenage boys are not there.
No, I'm with you on that. In fact, neither of my kids show any interest at all in what goes on underneath the hood. And even though I was sort of more of an athlete and loved reading and writing and stuff, I was very curious about it. And I felt, and part of my father's belief was, it was part of my education as a man that I had to know how to change the oil in my own car, and I had to do a requisite amount of tire changings and other things in order for him to feel like, okay, he could let me out in the world. But I think that's interesting. Again, it comes back to, how are we programming this generation of kids? And I wonder what the research says about women who are willing to marry a plumber or to marry an electrician, and they want that they would be proud to say, "Oh, my husband, the electrician," or would they feel like, with their professional standing as becoming increasingly more executive level doctor or lawyer, that they would be ashamed to have one who's an electrician?
Yeah, people have studied this and looked at this around the United States, and women tend to be pretty practical. Women in the United States, when they're looking at who they're going to marry, they'd like to marry a man whose earning potential is higher than their own, is at least equal to, preferably higher than their own. Very few women are really crazy about the idea of marrying a man who's never going to earn what they earn. And if that man's an electrician, but he's running a big shop and he's got men working for him and he's making $150,000 a year, that woman will have no objection whatsoever to marrying that man. It's not a question of his trade; it's a question of his income. But there's the problem, because what's happening. So again, Andrew Beveridge, the sociologist, demographer I mentioned earlier, looked at the big cities in the United States. This is very recent work, came out after the book was published. New York, Dallas, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. He found, when you look at people in those cities under 35 years of age, the young women are earning more, significantly more than the men are. And that's, again, a huge change. There's never been a generation in American history where the women earned more than the men did. And see, when a man's looking for a wife, her earning potential is not his number one consideration, has not traditionally been his number one consideration. Men have a number of criteria they bring into play when they think about a woman they're going to marry. But how much money she's going to earn is not the number one feature. That is, a man would be happy to marry a very attractive woman, even if she's not going to earn more money than he is. But women are different. A woman is not going to be particularly keen about marrying a man, even a very attractive man, if he's never going to have any chance of earning what she earns. This is another factor that's driving this plummeting fall in the rate of marriage, and indeed in the rate of cohabitation. Young women today much less likely to live with or marry young men for a variety of reasons, some of which we talked about. But this is another one, which is that the men aren't earning what the women are earning, and a woman does not want to marry a man who's never going to earn what she can earn.
Okay, this brings us back to then sort of a vision for the future. Let's follow this trajectory. And thank you. I can tell you've got a little bit of a cold, and I appreciate you hanging in there with us, because I know that you might prefer to be sitting up with some chicken soup somewhere. But thank you for this, because it's very interesting, and I couldn't help but look ahead and imagine a time when it almost seems like men are sort of like service drones, that they are called off the bench for reproductive purposes or for sort of specific applications. But by and large, we are heading into some sort of matriarchy. Is that a sci-fi exaggeration, or is there some truth
I think
to
it is a sci-fi exaggeration. Again, going back to Professor Gilmore's work, what's simply going to happen is that the secular English-speaking culture is going to vanish. It's going to be replaced with Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants. You go to an evangelical conservative community, and there you find these very traditional roles that are affirmed and welcomed, and you have masculine men and feminine women, and the community is flourishing. You mentioned Islam a moment ago, and I thought you'd be interested
and Judaism too, for that matter.
I actually included this in my manuscript, and the publisher insisted that we take it out. They thought it was inflammatory. Well, let me tell you what it was, and then I think you'll understand why. Professor Gilmore predicts that Western Europe will be predominantly Islam in 50 years. He doesn't see the numbers in this country. If you look nationwide, this country has 300 million people. Islam's a very tiny piece of that. It's about the same size as the Jewish community, roughly 6 million Islam, roughly 6 million Jews. That's just too small in the next 50 years for Islam to become a dominant force. But in Western Europe, the numbers are different. And he thinks that in Western Europe in 50 years, you will find that Islam is the dominant culture in Western Europe, that the traditional French and Spanish culture that we know will be gone, that Spain will return to being a Islamic country as it was 1,000 years ago, and France will become something very similar to Spain demographically. That is a country in which the Islamic community is the largest community, because the Islamic community is a community that celebrates marriage and children and celebrates men being men and women being women. The same is true of Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics. The same is true of evangelical Protestants.
Sure.
So your science fiction fantasy of a weird technological community where the men are servitors, well, that community doesn't reproduce, because, in fact, that's not the way humans work. Human marriages last when feminine women marry masculine men. That's very politically incorrect to say that, but that's simply empirically what you find, that the most stable marriages are marriages between feminine women and masculine men. Well, in our country, we are no longer creating feminine women and masculine men. In fact, we regard it as politically incorrect to even talk about such things. And the result is a society, in Professor Gilmore's estimate, a society that is going extinct, not leaving a continent unpopulated. The continent will be populated by cultures that value marriage and children, and the two cultures that he identified were, as I said, the Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics and the conservative evangelical Protestants.
And where is Judaism in this? A non-factor then?
It's a non-factor. The Jewish community, and I myself am, born and raised Jewish, is not a factor. It's a community. The Orthodox Jewish community would fit Professor Gilmore's prescription. Right. That is, the Orthodox Jewish community has feminine women, masculine men, and values marriage and children. But that's such a tiny sliver. Right. Maybe 1.5 million Orthodox Jews in the United States. It's just not going to be a significant player unless you're in Brooklyn.
Actually, I live in a Lubavitch neighborhood.
Okay, well then you see this. I do see that. Thriving communities, very strong, but as a slice of the whole country, it's tiny.
No, I totally see that too. All right, so then we'll get to all of the questions and answers for Dr. Leonard Sax. This has just been great, and I can only imagine where we're headed. The topic is the future of men. The book is Boys Adrift, but the research has been going on over a period of time with Dr. Leonard Sax, and the numbers for every survey that comes out, every women's magazine, every New York Times article I see, it just continues to confirm that it's not looking good for guys. We'll talk about it next hour, too. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnet. Well, while we're lining up the callers, let me grab Dr. Leonard Sax here for a minute before we go to the first break, because I want to take another stab at my sci-fi matriarchy scenario. And here's why. As I know a lot of women who are who gave up, who despaired of waiting for Mr. Right, and instead sort of settled for Mr. Right now, got pregnant by him. He is tangentially involved in the raising of the child, if at all, but she feels at least she has the child that she always wanted. And she doesn't have the relationship she always wanted, but she has the child. And I probably know I have to say off the top of my head, I think I can name 4 women who fall into that category who just got tired of waiting for a guy but still wanted to have a baby.
Sure, and we all know stories like that, but that's not a culture. That's not going to be the dominant lifestyle in the United States now or ever. That's just not an enduring way to create a civilization. And what works, is the family.
I'm not saying I want it that way. I'm not saying I think that's a good idea.
Well, my point is it won't become dominant because it doesn't work. It's very difficult. Raising a child is a demanding job, and where is that woman working during the day? So where is the child in daycare?
Yeah,
it creates. Yeah. It's just not a replicable situation on a national basis. It's not.
Well, it's not a desirable situation, but it seems like sort of a fallback place for a lot of women.
For a small proportion of women, that's what they will do. But what many women choose instead is not to have children. And we've got a growing proportion of young women in the United States who are single and have no intention of marrying because why do they want to hook up with one of these losers? Right. That's the fastest growing demographic, as I said earlier. Young adults, never married, living alone. And you talk to them, they say, it would be nice to be married and have a child, but it's not happening. If women that leads to the extinction of the culture.
Right. No, I'm that's certainly not what I'm interested in. But I'm curious because I know that in times past, when there have been not enough men, real men, for every woman to go around, it's turned into a situation of polygamy. We saw that in the Bible. It provided some stability at various times. Even in the expansion of this country with the Mormon beliefs,
it's not happening.
It's not going to. That won't happen either.
It's not happening because there are other options on this continent aside from secular English speakers. As I said, there are other cultures that are thriving on this continent. Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics, as I said, conservative evangelical Protestants, and in 100 years. That's when Professor Gilmore thinks you will find a very major influence of Islamic communities on this continent. Right now, the numbers, as he calculates it, in 50 years, you will still not have a major Islamic community. But in 100 years, you will. He said, if Islam was a stock, you'd want to buy it now because it is growing, and it is growing worldwide. And Western Europe and North America in 100 years, he thinks, will be primarily Islamic.
What about the mail order husband? What about for a woman who is affluent, she's got a job, she wants to find the right guy? Why isn't she bringing up somebody from El Salvador?
Because women want to marry men whose earning potential is greater than theirs.
Okay, but I mean, if that's the guy who's going to be laying concrete for that company, making $80,000 to $100,000 a year, why not? If the desirability is, I want to find a guy who's going to come here, who's going to work, and we're going to have a stable life together. Why wouldn't we see a different criteria than a mail order bride?
El Salvador is a Spanish-speaking Roman Catholic.
That's what I mean. So why don't we see?
They're doing very well, and he will start a family here, and he will have 6 kids, and in 50 years, that's going to be his grandchildren will be very numerous, and they value marriage, they value family, and they'll do very well.
All right, and so will we. Coming back, we'll get every call lined up for Dr. Leonard Sax. The book is Boys Adrift. The subject, the future of men, the future of our culture as it stands, as few as 30 years from now on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet. If you go to coasttocoastam.com, you'll see 2 stories that pertain to this conversation in one way or another. Child man in the promised land. I read part of that earlier about today's single young men who are hanging out in a hormonal limbo between adolescence and adulthood. That is so the theme of Dr. Leonard Sax's book, Boys Adrift. Also, I have Alice in Wonderland syndrome. You might want to take a look at that, too. Not exactly the same, but it's kind of interesting. And then it's also a thing in there about how certain sci-fi scenarios that will come true, most of those have to do with technological advances, but it just goes to show you, keeping an eye on the future is maybe maybe a prophylactic experience for what you're going through today. Prevent all sorts of troubles
And one of those is going to be for certain women out there. Good to have a heads up as to what the future of men are, the way it's looking as boys are adrift. Kara is on the wild card line on Coast to Coast AM in Ohio for Dr. Leonard Sax. Kara?
Good morning, men. I'm so excited about this conversation. It validates so much for me. My question is this. I grew up with a mother who was very much burn your bra, women's rights, blah, blah, blah. She encouraged me to have a career before I got married. A lot of her friends were getting divorced, and my parents are one of the few families that remained together through all of my growing up, all my teen years. My question is this. Is there some validity to that also causing women not to get married? Don't get married. Make sure you can support yourself. Once you can support yourself, if you have kids, you can always support yourself if things go south, because there are.
All right.
I tell you what, if I wanted to get married, I would totally marry Mr. Sax. Absolutely.
There you go. You're getting proposals, Leonard. How about that?
Yeah.
I love it.
Kara makes a good point, and actually that's the one factor we really haven't addressed, which is the changing role of masculine and feminine role models over the last 40 years. You go back 40 years, you look to see what were the popular TV shows that people were watching, things like Father Knows Best, My Three Sons. Today the most successful show in American history, The Simpsons. Homer Simpson is a slacker, and his son is a goofball. And so, there's been a big change in the culture where the role models that girls and boys have changed very profoundly. And I think it's great that women are working and accomplishing and achieving more. That's not the problem. I think the problem really is that their brothers have not kept up with them, and the role models that we offer young boys today are pretty pathetic.
There you go. And you never even addressed the Sax appeal issue that she's hitting on you, Dr. Sax. Did you hear that? She's proposing
I'm a happily married man. Thank you.
All right, better take that off the table then. Wild card line. Scott is in Kansas City on Coast to Coast AM. Scott?
Yes, sir. Good evening, gentlemen.
Evening.
I myself am a 30-year-old boy child who lives with his parents, still struggling to finish his Bachelor of Arts degree. My 28-year-old brother lives in the basement. And I was wondering, my parents divorced when I was 10. My father was an alcoholic, and I myself am a recovering alcoholic. And I was wondering if these two factors somewhat contribute to this scenario that we see right now.
The adult child of alcoholism kind of a thing, sure.
Yeah,
Dr. Sax?
Well, certainly, of course, alcohol doesn't help, but there has not been a significant change in the proportion of young men who are struggling with alcohol over the last 40 years. So we can't, the question I address in the book is, why do we find so many more young men today who are unmotivated, underachieving compared to 40 years ago? We cannot blame it on alcohol because there hasn't been a change in the rate at which young men are struggling with that issue.
Would you consider yourself to be unmotivated, Scott?
Yes and no. I remember actually being in the first grade and thinking that girls were smarter than us boys, that it was always girls who were smarter. In high school, I wasn't a bad student, but I didn't fulfill my potential. I'm fulfilling my potential much more, I think, now. I'm actually doing quite well in college, but
you're still underachieving.
Compared to where I thought I should be at the age of 22, 23, and
right.
Even now, the idea of having a regular 9-to-5 job is incredibly frightening for some reason. I really enjoy music and film and stuff like that, and these artistic ventures, but at the same time realize that needs to be tempered with something much more. I'd be incredibly frightened if I was 40 and living with my parents. It's my step-parent, my mom and my stepdad
right.
now.
Well, if I were you, of course, I just want to move out and get on my own and get college behind me just so I wouldn't be such a cliche.
It is a
that's
joke.
what I would hate.
No.
It'd be awful.
Thanks for making me feel better.
I'm sorry, but that's how I'd be start tomorrow. Don't be a cliche.
No, I graduate in fall, this fall. So, at least I have that going for me. In talking to girls, it's ridiculous. I feel a lot of what Dr. Sax was talking about earlier. I've very rarely made the first move physically on many of the girls that I've dated, and even when I've tried to ask them out, it's been incredibly difficult, and I've had to have girls make their overtures at me.
Well,
and it's something that I feel has been enculturated. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but
that may be a side discussion too. And thank you, Scott. Dr. Sax, actually, I was talking about that off the air with somebody. We were both saying how uncomfortable we are with all of these HR rules. You really don't know what to say. And like, if you were a single guy in the workplace and you were interested in a woman, how do you even begin to have that conversation without getting in trouble?
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, so let's go to Bruce, who's in L.A., listening to Dr. Leonard Sax on Coast to Coast AM. Bruce?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to call your guest's attention to a couple things. One is, when you get a marriage license these days, that's a three-party contract with the state. And you see the repercussions every day, with people getting separated, and then the guy gets wiped out. And I think this kind of discourages a lot of men. The other thing is, right now we're in an economic crisis, and thousands of jobs, are being sent overseas. So I'd like your comment on those, if you can, or would.
Well, those are factors that affect young men and young women equally. So, for example, some people will say, well, the reason men are living at home is because housing prices have gotten so expensive. Look how expensive it is. Yes, but women have to pay this. Women don't get a discount when they go to buy a home or rent a home, and women are not living at home with their parents the way young men are. You look at 30-year-olds living with their parents; it's much more likely that that's a young man that we're talking about than a young woman. So certainly economic factors are important, but they don't explain the gender gap, the fact that young women are achieving and young men are not.
Bruce, I mean, if the woman can get a job, why can't the guy?
Well, I don't know.
Are you one of those
guys? I never had any trouble, but I know a lot of people are these days.
Well, I guess that's the question is, back to what Dr. Sax said, is it disproportionate that men can't find jobs but women can? Or is it really more the fact that men aren't willing to take the jobs that are out there and they are more inclined to want to stay in this sort of extended adolescence, like we heard from the last caller? And that's kind of the new phenomenon. I appreciate your comment. Let's go international line. Kevin is in Vancouver for Dr. Leonard Sax on Coast to Coast AM. Kevin?
Hi, good evening, guys. Great show.
Thank you.
I wanted to just mention I've sort of seen the A and B sides with my two boys, 19 and 15, and I heard that soya milk is a big contributing factor to estrogen levels in men. So tofu and soy, is that something you're aware of?
I hadn't heard that, but that's
a very good question, and I looked into that very carefully. The research actually is mixed on that point. So I ended up not including that whole discussion in the book because with the plastics, polyethylene terephthalate and bisphenol A, it's very clear that this is having a negative effect on boys and men. With tofu and soy products, the research is much more complex, and there's no consensus because, yes, on the one hand, you see that these soy isoflavones do have estrogen-like effect. On the other hand, you look at China and rural China, where these soy products have been used for hundreds of years, and you don't find this phenomenon at all. In fact, something we haven't talked about during this interview is the international variation in this phenomenon. Throughout the United States,
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah, throughout the United States and Canada, you very much find this, and you absolutely find it in British Columbia. I spoke in Kamloops last couple months ago, which is in BC, and I'll be in Vancouver later this year. Absolutely find this phenomenon throughout Canada as you do in the United States. But you don't find it in East Asia or South Asia. You don't find Chinese boys, you don't find boys in Bangalore or Mumbai who are unmotivated compared to their sisters. On the contrary, boys in Bangalore and Shanghai are driven, hardworking, intense, motivated, the way North American boys used to be 30, 40 years ago. And yet those boys in East Asia and South Asia are eating all kinds of soy products. So it's it's a complex story. I don't think the answers are on the soy question. You made a good point that the soy isoflavones appear to have an estrogen-like effect, and yet in cultures that traditionally have used them, in East Asia and South Asia, we don't find this phenomenon.
No, what about Japan?
Japan's, you're very perceptive that I didn't mention Japan.
Yeah, that's weird.
Japan does have a version of this phenomenon. It's called hikikomori, and a wonderful book on this hikikomori phenomenon in Japan called "Shutting Out the Sun" by an American a journalist. Shutting Out the Sun. David Zeelenziger is the name of the journalist who wrote this book. He's been in Japan for the last 20 years. Now a rapidly growing proportion of Japanese men who have disengaged from society, who are living at home and don't leave the home, actually. They stay in their home. Their mothers make their meals, put them on a tray outside the boy's door. The boy opens his door, takes the tray, eats the meal, puts the finished tray out. The mother is expected to then take this away. It's becoming a big issue in Japan. In North America, if you talk about domestic violence, you're usually talking about a man beating his wife. In Japan, if you talk about domestic violence, you're almost always referring to an adult son beating up his mother. It's becoming a big issue in Japan. It's a weird phenomenon. It's different than what we're seeing in North America, primarily in that it is what psychologists call ego dystonic. What I mean by that is that young men in the United States and Canada who are not motivated don't seem to be bothered by it. They seem to be pretty comfortable with it. Japanese men who are succumbing to this phenomenon are not happy about it. They think it's somebody's fault, and they usually blame it on their parents, and they take it out on their mother. So it's a different phenomenon. I mention it in the book, but if you're really interested in what's happening in Japan, you'd want to read that book, Shutting Out the Sun by David Zeelenziger.
And at least while I've got you on the subject, does anything have to do with the rise of pornography in Japan as well, which I know is following a similar pattern here in the United States?
Well, I certainly have had emails from men in Japan. One man in Japan who told me he much prefers the girls in Japanese anime to the real girls. The girls in Japanese anime are pretty and they're submissive and they're just the way he likes them. And the real girls are obnoxious and demanding and don't particularly like Japanese men. They prefer Canadian and British men. And again, it comes back to the point that you and I discussed earlier, that increasingly boys in Japan, as in North America, value the virtual world over the real world. You know, what I'd like to say to this young man is, look, the Japanese anime, that's an image on a computer screen. That's not a real girl. And you know, the real girl should be more important than an image on a computer screen. But that's a generational divide. Teenage boys very often say that they prefer the online image to the real thing.
And I wonder, too, whether involved in that, too, isn't a discussion about addiction again, but this time not alcohol, but sex addiction, the pornography addiction, and that it ends up taking over a part of their mental space that they devote emotionally to things that cannot emotionally respond back, and it just increases the alienation. Well, we'll come back. We've got everybody lined up for Dr. Leonard Sax. Lots of calls, including yours, and we'll give you all the numbers you need to know for the last half hour of Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet. Our guest has been Dr. Leonard Sax. If you're just tuning in now, you've missed a lot of great material. I'll try and sum it up to you this way. The future of men is looking bleaker because of how we are raising our boys. And it's not just us. I mean, that is to say, you might not be doing it. I know I'm not doing it, but that there are a number of people out there that have looked at boys as just being defective girls, treated that way as they were growing up. The things they needed in school they weren't given. That is to say, lots of PE and recess times just to kind of get the wiggles out, or the kind of class focus that girls were getting because it was perceived that girls needed all this extra push to get to the top. Well, whether they did or they not, they did, and they're now here they are in disproportionate numbers on college campuses and on graduation day and in professional schools, and boys are adrift. And in fact, too many of these super adolescents are going into young adulthood when they would have been buying homes, and instead all they're doing is buying new PlayStations and living in mom and dad's basement. This is a trend which is getting worse, and it has huge ramifications for our future. We've been talking about both the physiological impact on boys as a result of certain bottled water products or bottled juice products or pop, what they're consuming, what the environment factors are, and of course also then the psychology of how boys have been thought of and needed to be corrected, and the law of unintended consequences that we're paying for right now. Back to your questions and comments for Dr. Leonard Sax. Oh, if you're going to the website at coasttocoastam.com, there's a couple of stories about that, and you can also link up to the blog there. I put one up earlier from Crypto News. If you missed it on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnet. I'm on a mission to get everybody in before the end of this hour for Dr. Leonard Sax. East of the Rockies, Steve is in Connecticut on Coast to Coast AM. Steve?
Hi. Okay, well, what the world that your guest, the doctor, is describing is just, for my own reality, my experience, completely different. And I can say the single women, young women that I go out with or that I know, most of them live with their family. And it's really annoying, because when you take a girl home and the parents are there in the living room, it's a downer. And I know a lot of teenagers, the ones I know, and I know a lot of them, the boys, they're totally girl crazy. What they want to do, they want to party and get laid. The second bulk of them they're into sports. They want to play sports and get laid. Very few of them just want to stay home and play video games and don't care about sex. And I think the few that do, it's not what they want. They're probably lacking the skills and the physical attributes to do that. And the girls, I'm just saying what I know, and I know a lot of them, and they're boy crazy. They don't say, well, I'm not going out with boys. They're losers. I'm going to be with girls. No, they're with guys. They have sex from a very young age here in this part of the country. And when they are with their friends who are girls, they're talking about guys. They're checking out guys. They're talking about how to meet guys. The only thing I notice, which to me is perhaps a change and a concern, and I'm thinking what's going on, is I notice that, I hope this isn't too racy for the show, but a lot of them seem to be the young ones, teenagers, young, 20s, seem to be liking girls also, and they also seem to be very violent, more so than in the past with other girls. They're aggressive. And my last point about the plumber, $100,000, it's not a lot of money. A top lawyer, a top doctor, top MBA, they'll make millions a year. And when a plumber starts making $5 million a year, I'll be lining up at plumbing school.
Well, very few lawyers make that kind of money, and I come from a family of lawyers. And if you're saying top lawyers making that kind of money, top. Very, 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 very top, but you might as well be an offensive guard for the Lakers. Go ahead, Dr. Sax, you have a thought on some of those points?
I'm curious to know more about this community in Connecticut. Where is it? Can you tell me more about it? Maybe we can learn some lessons from them.
Well, I'm not speaking just of Connecticut, but I would say the Northeast, Connecticut, the surrounding states, New York. I mean, this is... I believe that I know them, and I don't know, maybe in other parts of the country, perhaps, more Bible Belt areas, it's not the case. But here I believe that teenagers are having sex from a young age, and I don't think that they're...
I don't think that's his point, though.
Whether or not they're having sex is not the point.
You're missing that.
Yeah, a lot of people are having sex.
Well, but what I'm saying is they're not...
Let Dr. Sachs respond to that. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the assertion is not that kids are not having sex. The question is, what are kids passionate about? What are their motivations? What are their life scripts? And statistically, around the United States, when you ask who's graduating with honors, it is empirically a fact that when you look at colleges and universities around the United States today, that 4 out of 5 kids graduating with honors are women. I would be curious to know at your local high school, when you look at the top 10 students, if your community is indeed so unusual, is it different? Is your valedictorian a boy rather than a girl? At most American high schools now, the valedictorian is a girl. The editor of the yearbook is a girl. The editor of the school newspaper is a girl. The president of the student council government is a girl. I would assume in your community, though, that's not the case. And you've got a very unique community where the boys are still as likely as the girls are to be the president of the student council government, to be the editor of the newspaper, to be chairman of the debate club.
Well, I wasn't disputing anything you were saying about academic achievement. That's a different topic, and I don't even know enough to dispute that. I was just saying that I in terms of the girls, the comment about girls are saying that guys are losers and they just want to hang out with the girls.
No. You're not, we're not talking about 15-year-olds. Just so, I mean, I think that may be the problem. You may have
also 20s.
Okay. Well, let me ask Dr. Sax. I appreciate it, and you've had a lot to say in there, and let's just move on. But Dr. Sax, at what age are we talking about where that comment becomes what you start to hear in the research?
Well, we're talking about people in their 20s. That is, when you interview young adults, why is it the case that the women are less likely to marry men? It's because they really don't want to in many cases. In many cases, they can't find the right man. They're looking for a man who has an income-earning potential greater than their own, and those men are in short supply.
Let's go west of the Rockies, where we've got James in Idaho on Coast to Coast AM. James?
Hello.
Hi, you're talking with Dr. Sax.
Hello, Doctor. Hello, Ian.
Hello.
Hey.
I want to talk about the changes in the salmon you were talking about on the Columbia.
Right.
I live up here just off the Salmon River, and I've noticed over the years, everybody's gone crazy about weed spraying up here using herbicide, and we've had a lack of frogs, for one. We've got salmon on the endangered species list, et cetera, et cetera. There was a good article in Harper's a while back where this girl did a study. Well, she wrote a book about a whole bunch of scientific studies through all sorts of universities back east where they studied atrazine in herbicides that were changing the physiology of frogs. They'd grow 2 heads and 2 tails and 2 sets of sex organs and whatever, But anyway, I think that's a big factor in the physical part of things that are changing.
Okay. Dr. Sax, thought on that?
Yeah, Ian, earlier you had suggested that maybe the problems we were seeing were just in urban areas. That's certainly not the case, as this caller from Idaho points out. These endocrine disruptors are very much in the rivers and the streams all around the United States, and caller's also making a good point that a lot of these pesticides that are widely used in American farming now that didn't exist 50 years ago are having effects a lot more subtle than, 50 years ago people were using DDT, which had disastrous effects, as Rachel Carson documented in her book Silent Spring. Now they've replaced them with other chemicals that don't kill animals, but they do affect their sexual reproduction. And so we're seeing a lot of these feminized or emasculated wildlife around the western United States.
First-time caller line, Sean is in California on Coast to Coast AM. Sean?
Hello, yes. I think I kind of understand what you're talking about as far as the psychological effect. And I just wanted to ask about whether, having too much testosterone could actually be a contributing factor. I know you mentioned about the estrogen, but...
what do you mean by that? Too much testosterone?
Well, they also said that can contribute to hair loss when the body is sort of rejecting its own testosterone.
Dr. Sax, thought on that?
Yeah, I'm a little confused by the question. It seems the caller is referring to perhaps to athletes who are injecting themselves with anabolic steroids to get a competitive advantage, which has a lot of problems, but that's not really what we're talking about here.
Okay. Can you tell me any solutions that I know there's really not a lot out there, but me being I'm an older brother, and I've come in contact with this type of condition, and I just
with the too much testosterone or the lack of testosterone.
Well, I mean, just being like a hairy person, I thought that might.
Oh. Right. No. Okay. Interesting question, Dr. Sax. A thought on?
No. Whether or not you are hairy or not is not an indicator of your testosterone levels.
There you go. Although I wonder whether the thought of what is considered to be a proper testosterone level now, or what might be considered overly loaded with testosterone, will change with this dramatic drop that we talked about, where generally adolescents are about 50% of the testosterone level of their grandparents.
Well, you're making a good point, which is, for example, in Japan, we mentioned Japan a moment ago. Japan is really leading the world in this metrosexual culture. This is this notion that the ideal young man now plucks his eyebrows and plucks his chest hair and gets his hair removed and kind of has a feminine appearance. And again, as we mentioned earlier, there's this tendency that the men are becoming less masculine and the women are becoming more masculine. But the amount of chest hair that a man has is not a reliable indicator of his testosterone level.
Let's go to Wildcard Line. I think it's, is it Jerry in North Carolina on Coast to Coast AM? Jerry? Or Jimmy? Jimmy, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I couldn't read my writing.
Great show. I guess I'm kind of in the middle. I'm 34. I just got home from work. It's a business that I own, and I'm living in my, I'm a homeowner. But on the other side of it, while I was waiting, I was playing video games. I just finished a soy protein shake, and I have man boobs. So, but all kidding aside, when you say something like a 50% decrease in sperm count just in 2 generations.
Yep.
I got to admit, I'm hearing Alex Jones over here in my ear going, they're
conspiracy
doing
theory.
To reduce the population and at the same time emasculate a few generation of men who I guess wouldn't be able to stand up and fight if it came to that. You know what I mean?
Well, that's
is there any way to tell whether or not it's just some type of
external thing?
Yeah, if it's just a reaction to like a male-dominated society for so long.
Well, sure. And again, a lot of this research is in that chapter in my book, Boys Adrift. So, for example, in one study, they looked around Western Europe, and they found that in Copenhagen, Denmark, highly urban area, the sperm count was very, very low. But if you look in Latvia, that is a much less developed country where they don't have the plastics and the synthetics that we have, the sperm counts are much higher. So it's certainly not a conspiracy because you find this internationally, and it's not a function of political ideology or religion or anything else. It's a function of developed countries. Developed countries using all these chemicals is where you find the sperm counts dropping. Undeveloped countries where they don't have the sophisticated pesticides and chemicals, you find the sperm counts are still where they were 50 years ago.
You've been a total trooper, Dr. Sax. I really do appreciate that. I know. Well, you're almost there. You're almost across the finish line. We've got Wildcard Line. Rick is in Illinois. He could be my brother-in-law. I have a brother-in-law named Rick who lives in Illinois. Rick, is that you? Oh, no, he dropped. Okay, yeah, that's definitely my brother-in-law. Wildcard Line. Allison is in Canada on Coast to Coast AM. Allison?
Hi.
Hi, you're talking with Dr. Sax.
Okay, I actually wanted to sort of take this in a different direction than like the endocrine disruptors in terms of looking at providing for men. In most traditional societies, the onus of providing materially for a family was on both men and women. Definitely historically, when the home was a unit of production, women were providing materially for their families. And I think our society is quite unique in that we have a particular onus on men that's asymmetrically, that they are the ones to provide. And I think in the last 30 years, the philosophies that sort of shored up that sort of unfair asymmetry have been deconstructed and recast as sinister and oppressive towards women. And I just wonder, because we've been talking a lot about how, I guess, men are dropping the ball, but I look around me and I see a lot of women who are complaining about the fact that they don't have men in their lives. And at the same breath, the same note, they express such contempt and anger towards men. And I really,
What does that tell you?
Well, to me, I think that, well, first of all, I think it's a dysfunctional way of looking at the world to have such bigotry towards, a group of people. And
which group of people?
Well, men, of course.
Okay. I'll just check it. Because it seems like, I think maybe this goes back to a point Dr. Sax was making earlier about perhaps how maybe we deconstructed too much. And Dr. Sax, you want to address this issue?
Well, sure. And the caller, I suspect very much the caller is calling from Ontario. Is that correct?
No, Alberta.
Oh, my goodness. Calgary?
Yep.
Okay. So Calgary, the Prairie provinces, that is Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Calgary, Alberta, very interesting in this regard. So you go to Statistics Canada, statcan.ca, you can pull up some very interesting numbers. In the United States, as I mentioned earlier, admissions to medical schools, the medical school is very careful to maintain a 50-50 gender balance regardless of who's applying. But in Canada, that's not the case. In Canada, admissions are gender blind. So, for example, who's attending a medical school in Canada? The applicant pool is almost exactly 50-50. But who's getting accepted? That is, who's qualified? It's nationwide in Canada, it's 58 to 42. And in Quebec, which is the most remarkable province in this regard, it's 70-30. That is, 70% of Canadian medical students in Quebec are women. At Université Laval, it's 74%. At McMaster, it's 73%. This, I think, is very striking. What's happening at Canadian universities, and this is a very good report on this at Statistics Canada, is that the women are working hard and the men are goofballs. The men are not keeping up. The boys are not keeping up with their sisters. So a very similar phenomenon, actually more pronounced in Canada than we see in the United States. For example, in the United States, we have this field of veterinary medicine, which 50 years ago was overwhelmingly male, is now overwhelmingly female, which is a 70-30 ratio of women to men at veterinary schools in the United States. But in Canada, we're actually seeing a more exaggerated gender imbalance, not only in veterinary medicine, but in human medicine. The great majority of young Canadian doctors now are women because Canadian medical schools make no effort to maintain an artificial 50-50 balance. They admit kids based on merit rather than trying to keep it equal.
Well, that's all the time we that's all the time we have for that question. I know there was more there to it, and I'm sure you have more on the answer. And I want to commend Allison. When I was in grad school, we used to keep track of who could work in the greatest number of academic buzzwords into a sentence, and I had to give her like 30 points for that one. That's why
I thought she was from Ontario.
Yeah, that was a really good one. I have to say she did much better than most of the guys I know, for whatever that's worth. And so thank you so much, too, for Dr. Leonard Sax for the time you gave, and also because I know you weren't feeling at your best, but it was a great show, and it gave us all a lot to talk about. Even if Allison or others in the end don't agree with it, a lot to think about there in the future of Boys Adrift.
Will go to boysadrift.com as well. If they want to send me an email, they can do it through that website.
Boysadrift.com. Thank you so much, Dr. Leonard Sax. Have a great night, and Deus te amat, and I do too.